In this video, we're going to go over the mini projects in VBA Part II. So again, if you watched the previous video, you know that I started this workbook called mini projects. There's really nothing in this workbook except I inserted this module into this workbook where I put these mini projects into this module. Right. So I'm gonna first copy this mini project 1 in VBA Part 2 into the module. The goal of mini project 1 is to change the color of the last column here to blue. Okay. And also change the color of the last row here to red. But in changing the last row's color, I only want to change the color up to this cell. I don't want to overwrite this color. So this is still blue and this is red. Okay. Requirement here is that we're assuming that we don't know the size of the table. So the table could have any number of columns and any number of rows. We always operate on the last column and the last row. So that's the assumption. So as I discussed in the previous video, so if you want to directly refer to the ranges without saying which workbook and which worksheet you're trying to refer to, then at the beginning you want to activate the workbook and the worksheet, right? So in the previous exercise, what I did is I activated if you remember, I sort of activated the workbook first. Activate, and then I activated the worksheet. So I used the two-step approach before. So you can see here. Okay, it's like what I did here. So another way to do this is to activate the workbook and worksheet all together in one line. So this is the same as this, right? So in this code, I'm going to use a slightly different flavor by activating them all together. But you should understand this is the same as activating the workbook first and then activate the worksheet, like what we did here. So here you can also use a one-line approach. Okay. So I want to make sure that the current active workbook is VBA Part 2. So that's the workbook that contains the data. You should be able to download this from Canvas. Okay. And the worksheet should be mini project 1. Right? And after that, I need to figure out how to refer to or how to select this last column in the data. Right? So this requires the end property of cells. Right? So first of all, I've tried to figure out the starting point of this range. The starting point of this range goes from here to here. So this is going to be the starting point, and this is going to be the ending point. Right. So the starting point, if I start from A1 to reach this point, I need to say A1, this is the cell A1, and then dot the end property. And exactly which end? The right end of A1. Right. So that's going to be the starting point of my range here. Okay. And what's the ending point? The ending point of this range is here. So how do I go from A1 to here? So I can go either from A1 to here first, and then from here to here. Or I can go from A1 to here first, and then from here to here. Right? So let's see what I did here is I first go from A1 to the right end of the table. So A1 dot end XL to right. And then this combination refers to E1. Okay. Now how do I go from E1 to here? This cell is the down end of E1. So basically this is E1 dot end XL down. So that will take me to this point. Right? So what's the syntax here? If you look at the big picture here, this whole thing, remember the syntax here is if you want to refer to a range, you can say some cell. So I guess the first one would be the upper left corner cell, and the second argument would be the lower right corner of the cell. For example, if you want to select a range like this, then you can do range B18, comma D23. So this would be B18, and after the comma, this one would be D23. Okay. So this syntax represents this whole area. Okay. And of course, because now I'm only trying to select one column, so there's no left or right. It's just upper and lower, right? So it's just top and bottom. So in this case, the first one would be the top, and the second one would be the bottom. So that's the syntax. That's the syntax I'm applying in this part. Okay. So this part will basically select the last column, and then I can say interior color change to blue. Okay, so you should be familiar with that by now. Next step, I would like to change the last row except this cell to red. Again, I'm using the same syntax, right? In this case, because I only have one row, so it's really the first, that range something, comma something. The first something would be the left, and the second input would be the right. Right? So I just need to say range this cell, comma this cell. Right? So how do I get to this cell? That's from A1 to the down end. And then comma, how do I get to this cell? Remember, this cell is the same as what we used before, right? So you can just copy this part down here. This is the corner. But this cell is not what we want. What we want is really this cell, because we want to go from here to here. So after getting to this cell, we need to attach an offset property to the end of it. Because when you have a cell like this, dot offset, if you do dot offset 0, -1, remember the first one, the first input here in the offset is the movement in a row. For example, if the first argument is equal to 1, then you would add one row to the next cell here. The second input here is column. For example, if the second column here is equal to 1, then you would add one column to the right here. But since we want to move to the left, so you have to subtract one column. So that's why this is -1, and we're staying in the same row, so the first one is 0. Right? So attaching this allows you to go from here to here, which is what we want. Right? So after selecting this range, you would have attached interior color and change to red. So at this point, you might be wondering, okay, why do I always start from A1 to go somewhere else, right? For example, if I want to select the last column, why can't I just directly start from here, say range E1 to E9, right? So that's the top and that's the bottom, so that gives me this column. So for this particular data, this is correct. This refers to the last column, right? But remember, the assumption of this project is that we don't really know the size of the table, right? We don't really know the number of columns. We don't know the number of rows. So we don't know which is the last column or which is the last row, right? So that's why, well, the only thing we know is that there must be some data at least in A1, right? So there might be a second column, there might be a second row, or not. We don't know. So the only thing we know is there's some data here, and it could be big or it could be small. Right? So that's why we cannot assume what is the last column and what is the last row like this. That's why we use this AND property starting from A1, which we know contains data, and then go to the edge of the data automatically. So we can run the code step by step. The first steps, make sure we're selecting this. Okay, second step, changes the color. So after you finish this project, you probably want to review a few concepts here. First of all, as you can see, to refer to cell A1, I here use the shorthand, if you remember this, right? There are different ways to do this. You can replace this bracket A1 by, say, range A1, right? That's the same. Or you can say cells 1, 1. Or you can say, let me see if there's another way to do this. No, I think that's about it, right? You can use either of these three approaches to refer to A1. Think about these different alternatives. The other thing is, for the AND property, if you say some cell dot AND, right? So basically what you're doing is, let's say if you're saying some cell, let's say if I want to say E3 dot AND XL down, right? So what does this mean? It means if you point your cursor at E3, so you make E3 selected, and then you do Control down, right? So the cursor or the active cell will end up here. Then this cell here would be E3 and XL down, right? So that's how you figure out what does this AND give you, right? Or for example, if I want to say B2 XL to right. So which cell do I get using this property? So I start from B2 and do Control to right. So I use the right arrow. So Control right arrow. That gives me here. So that means B2 and XL to right is E2. So that basically takes you to the edge of the data, right? When you do XL down, it takes you to the bottom of the data. When you do XL right, it takes you to the right boundary of the data. Or you can do XL up or XL to left, right? So you can imagine you can experiment a little bit. But the important to understand is it does the same thing as Control right. Sorry, it does the same thing as Control right, or Control down, or Control up, or Control left. Another thing you want to experiment a little bit is when in the previous example I showed you, I always start from some cell inside this data range, right? I start from here to go right, or go down, or go up, or go left, right? So you can figure out where it goes. So, but what if I start from here? What if I start from outside the data? In this case, if I do, let's say, range, if I do E12 dot AND XL up, in this case, what do I get? Right? Again, you can experiment a little bit. So if you go here and do Control up, it gets into the first cell of the next data range. Right? So when you use this approach, you want to be careful. So in this case, you only have one kind of area that contains data. Sometimes you could have multiple areas that contains data, and there's some empty cells in between. So when you use this property, you want to be sure you know, depending on the starting point, this AND property will get you to different locations. So you probably want to exercise that a little bit to make sure you understand it properly. Okay, now let's move on to the second mini project here. So I have VBA 2 mini project 2. Let's copy that into my VB editor here. Again, because the data I need for this project is in worksheet mini project 2, so I first want to activate this workbook and the second worksheet in here to make sure I'm on the right data set. And then I'm going to basically add a line to the bottom that provides the total. So let's run this code and see what happens. Step 1, remember I want to activate this. Let's see what happens if I run this. So you can see when you activate this second worksheet, then the current tab becomes this one. Right? So the data is shown here. So what I want to do is I would like to add a total line here. The first column value here should say total, and then these values should be the sum of the column above. Right? So you should understand how to, for example, if I'm trying to select this column, or if I'm trying to select this column, or if I'm trying to select this column, you should understand how to do that by now, right? And also, in the first step, I want to put the word total in this cell. You should also understand how to do that. One thing to pay attention to is, you can see when I use the AND property here, I didn't start from A1, right? So according to the example I showed you just earlier, if I start from A1 and I do AND XL down, then I will not get here, right? I'll leave it to you to figure out. If I start from A1 and do AND XL down, where do I get to, right? I'll leave that question to you. So instead, I start from A2 and do XL down, so that gets me here. And then I need to move down one more row, so I need to do offset 1, 0. So that gives me an extra row here. So now I'm in this cell. I'm going to change the value of that to total. Okay. So in the second step, at first I want to get to this cell, right? And then I want to sum these up and put the value in this cell. So to get to the bottom cell, basically I'll do the same thing here. I'm starting from B2 and do XL down. Here is actually okay if you want to do B1 XL down. That will get you here too. And then you do offset to move one more row. Right? So here I use the B2, so I start from here, go down here, and then one more. You can also start from B1, go down here, and one more. It's the same thing. So how do I calculate the sum of these values? So we're going to use the sum function from Excel. So to call an Excel function, what you need to do is to say, first of all, the function I'm trying to call is sum. So let's try to use sum in Excel itself. So if I want to do sum in Excel, I would say equal to sum, and then put these value in sum, right? And then hit enter. That'll give me the sum, right? So the question is, how do I realize this in VBA? It's pretty straightforward. First of all, you use the same function, which is sum. The only difference is you have to add an application dot sum. So basically this tells you this is the sum function provided by Excel. Right? And then the same thing. So inside sum, I need to provide this column. So here I also need to provide a column, that column, inside this sum function. Right? So how do I provide this column? So that's simply the range from B2 to B2 XL down. Right? So you should know how to do this now. You should be able to understand what we're doing inside this sum. That's just the column here. Alright, so I'm gonna delete that. Okay. And the next 3 rows are basically the same. They're just working on different columns. Right, so this one works on column B, and then C, and then D, and then E. So that gives you all 4 column results. So I would suggest you spend a little time to make sure you understand how to call an Excel function in VBA. Right, give yourself a different example. For example, we learned how to do let's say we learned how to do NPV function, right? So we use the NPV function to calculate NPV in Excel, right? So ask yourself, for example, if I were to say I have a column with, with the cash flows, right? And also I have some value of discount rate stored somewhere, right? So how do I write a code in VBA to calculate the present value of all these cash flows given that discount rate and put that present value in some cell here, right? Give yourself this exercise and try to figure that out. Okay, so now let's run the code just to see the results. Right, so as you can see, now we have a row that says total, which is the sum of these values above.